Night descends over the empire like a velvet decree. The call to prayer fades into the wind, and the city exhales into silence. Topkapı's gilded domes glimmer faintly, but within its heart, the light dares not enter. The palace sleeps, but not peacefully. It listens. Lanterns gutter in the courtyards, their flames bowing before the wind as if in reverence to the ghosts that linger here. Corridors stretch into darkness, the tiles cold beneath unseen feet. Somewhere, behind a door older than memory, the air still carries a faint perfume, rosewater, dust, and something human that time refused to cleanse. You stand in that silence now, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down from every marble arch. They called this place the Jewel of Empires. But listen closely, and the walls betray a different story, one that was whispered, not written. You can almost hear it, beneath the hum of history, the echo of chains that never rattled, the sound of a prayer half finished, the heartbeat of a world that learned to hide its cruelty behind beauty. Every empire builds its monuments to eternity. The Ottomans built theirs in stone, silk, and secrecy. From the deserts of Arabia to the frozen frontiers of Europe, their banners caught the sun like fire. Cities rose at their command. Rivers changed their course to serve imperial gardens. To the outside world, it was paradise by discipline, a civilization draped in art, poetry, and divine law. But you and I know. Where perfection reigns, mercy seldom lives. The empire's strength was not just in armies or scripture, it was in order. And order demands sacrifice. For beneath the prayer towers and marble courts lay a hidden mechanism, a quiet industry of obedience. It hummed through palaces and mosques alike, through the breath of servants and the ink of scribes. It was the unseen trade of flesh, silence, and loyalty. The empire's beauty had a cost, and the palace walls were its ledger. Step further in. The sound of fountains fades. The air thickens with candle smoke and secrecy. Here, behind the silk curtains, power is not spoken, it is performed. The Sultan's shadow stretches through these halls, reaching even into the lives of those who will never speak his name aloud. They say his authority was divine. But divinity, here, was not born of light, it was born of control. Venetian envoys once wrote of these chambers with envy and wonder. They described the mosaics, the gardens, the fragrance of jasmine drifting from unseen courtyards. They imagined pleasure. They imagined paradise. But their eyes never saw the door that did not open. Their ink never touched the names that history refused to record. Because what they called enchantment was captivity. What they called grace was silence. And what they called paradise was, in truth, a cage gilded so beautifully that even suffering learned to smile. Every empire hides a chamber where its ideals decay. For the Ottomans, that chamber was not a dungeon or a battlefield, it was the harem. A labyrinth of discipline and desire, ruled by law, guarded by mutilation, and fueled by purity turned into policy. Here, beauty was not worshipped, it was weaponized. Across the empire, soldiers and tax collectors combed the villages under orders that bore the Sultan's seal. They did not come for gold. They came for daughters. For skin unscarred by the sun. For eyes that did not yet know defiance. They told families it was an honor, a divine calling, to serve the palace, to join the household of God's chosen ruler. But the mothers who clutched their children knew what empires never write down, that you cannot gild a cage and call it destiny. The empire named it Devserm, the levy of human tribute. Boys were taken to become soldiers of faith. Girls were taken to preserve the bloodline of power. Virginity became a form of taxation, innocence, a commodity. Each child torn from their home was another stone in the foundation of imperial order. And the empire called it justice. This is where the story begins, not in glory, but in the silence that glory demands. The marble remembers what the scribes erased. The walls still breathe what the poets never dared to write. Welcome to the empire of silk and shadows. Where beauty hides cruelty, and obedience is mistaken for grace. Where the light of civilization was born from a darkness so profound that even time averts its gaze. And tonight, beneath the trembling glow of the palace lanterns, you will see that darkness for what it truly was. Because here, behind the gilded doors of history, the most exquisite things ever crafted were not art, or poetry, or empire. They were lies. Night never truly leaves the empire, it only hides inside its laws. The same silence that once lingered in the palace stretches outward across plains and valleys, riding on the backs of messengers who carry the Sultan's decree. A piece of parchment sealed in gold moves faster than any sword. It travels through deserts, over rivers, past crumbling monasteries and villages wrapped in frost, until it reaches doors that never asked to open. They called it the Devserm, the human tribute. To the empire, it was order. To the world it conquered, it was loss written in official ink. From each province came a number. From each village, a list of names. Boys for the barracks, girls for the palace. The balance of a world measured in flesh. The collectors did not arrive like raiders, they arrived like judges. No torches, no screams, just the rustle of paper and the glint of imperial emblems pressed into wax. They spoke softly, almost kindly, because cruelty dressed in procedure does not need to raise its voice. Villagers gathered in courtyards under the watching eyes of imams and scribes. Names were read aloud. Heads were bowed. A mother's hand trembled against her son's shoulder, a father's throat closed around words that could never be spoken in the presence of law. The men who enforced the decree believed themselves righteous. They quoted verses about duty, destiny, and divine hierarchy. They told families that their children would learn the language of power, that they would rise above the dust of their birth. But the dust was where love lived, and the empire did not understand love. Each chosen child became a number in the ledgers of Constantinople, a promise that the machine of obedience would not rust. The Janissary levy fed the empire's armies with soldiers whose loyalty was carved from forgetfulness. The female tribute filled the palaces with voices trained to sing the empire's praise until their own names disappeared. Two branches of the same system, one to defend the throne, the other to decorate it. Both taken from the same silence. In the hills of the Balkans, the wind still carries a faint melody. Old women hum it when the evenings grow long. No one remembers the full words, but the tune holds a wound. It speaks of doors that opened to strangers, of fathers who followed footprints until snow erased them. Of mothers who sat by rivers because the water moved in the same rhythm as the children they lost. The scribes never heard those songs. They recorded the levy as proof of divine order, a tax of faith rather than flesh. Their quills moved cleanly across parchment, never hesitating. A perfect line for every vanished life. Ink where once there had been breath. In distant capitals, foreign ambassadors praised the Ottoman system. They called it disciplined, efficient, enlightened. They saw only the glittering armor, the educated courtiers, the illusion of opportunity. None of them understood that a chain can be gilded until it looks like honor. The truth was simpler. The empire feared rebellion, and fear is most easily silenced when it is still young. By taking children, it harvested loyalty before loyalty could belong to anyone else. By taking daughters, it turned beauty into insurance, purity into politics. The levy was not punishment. It was prevention. When the soldiers finally left a village, they took more than the chosen. They took laughter from the streets, songs from the windows, and faith from the earth itself. What remained were parents staring at the road, measuring distance not in miles but in heartbeats. Some believed that obedience would protect them. Others cursed the heavens until their voices cracked. But the law was indifferent. The parchment was already signed. Centuries later, historians would debate its purpose. Some would call it pragmatic, others barbaric. The empire itself would remember it as necessity, a system that built armies, guarded palaces, expanded horizons. But the truth whispered from the ruins of those villages is quieter, heavier, and harder to escape. Empires are not built by swords alone. They are built by silences that no one dares to break. And so the human tribute continued, year after year, generation after generation, until the line between duty and despair became impossible to see. The ledgers filled. The palaces glowed. The marble shone. And somewhere, deep beneath the perfection of it all, the world learned that not every empire bleeds, it consumes. Subscribe to Tale of History if you dare to listen to what the stones remember. Because the stones do remember. And they are tired of whispering to themselves. Night folds itself over the empire again, but this time the silence moves with purpose. It seeps through mountain paths, along rivers that carry both trade and fear. Where the first decree of tribute ended, another begins, a quieter order, whispered between scribes, sealed by faith, and executed with calculation. They called it the hunt for purity. It was not conducted with swords, but with ledgers. Not with blood, but with signatures. In a world obsessed with lineage, the Sultan's household demanded certainty, every gesture, every birth, every breath controlled by ritual and record. And so the empire built a network of eyes that reached into every distant province. At its heart stood the bureaucrats, the tax collectors, the village imams, the provincial governors, men who dressed the unthinkable in ceremony. They traveled with scrolls rolled under their arms, bearing seals heavy enough to outweigh conscience. Their arrival in a village brought no trumpet, no warning, only the soft sound of hooves and the rustle of silk robes brushing against the ground. By day, they spoke of duty. By night, they wrote reports under oil lamps, tallying what the empire considered suitable offerings. Their pens scratched through names, adding notes in margins, complexion, posture, family history, faith. The empire turned purity into paperwork. It began as a census, a simple measure of order. But soon, the search grew more precise, more invasive, more deliberate. The administrators sought perfection, skin unmarked, eyes clear, speech gentle, demeanor compliant. Even the way a girl lowered her gaze could determine her future. One hesitation, one spark of resistance, and a family's entire fortune could unravel. Each record was signed, stamped, and forwarded to Constantinople. Every chosen name was a thread pulled from a living fabric, woven instead into the empire's tapestry of control. To the officials, it was organization. To the families left behind, it was the sound of destiny closing its fist. Across the empire's frontiers, routes were carved not only for merchants and armies, but for this quiet traffic of souls. Caravans crossed from the Balkans, the Caucasus, and Circassia, winding through narrow passes where the mountains learned to echo prayers they did not understand. Each stop was a checkpoint of silence, local governors collecting levies not in coin, but in innocence. From the northern coasts, ships departed under moonlight, their holds filled with trade goods, spices, and, hidden behind veils and shadows, people. The routes followed the same channels as commerce, merging morality with profit until the two became indistinguishable. On the sea, the air smelled of salt and resignation. By the time the ships reached Constantinople, the passengers no longer had names, only numbers. The city waited like a jewel carved from night, its domes reflecting light from 1,000 lanterns. But under that glow, other lights flickered, markets and courtyards where silence was currency. Every empire has a place where its humanity is negotiated. Here, it was the port, where buyers spoke softly and officials pretended not to hear. Records from European travelers mention these scenes, written in tones of fascination, not horror. They wrote of elegance, not sorrow, because to the outside world, the Ottoman system appeared civilized, orderly, almost divine. They saw transactions, not tragedies. They saw ritual, not ruin. Their ink carried the same blindness that history would later inherit. At the palace gates, another hierarchy waited, one older, quieter, and crueler. It was guarded by those whom the empire trusted most, the eunuchs. Once men, now altered beyond choice, they became the empire's perfect sentinels. They could be trusted to protect what others might desire. They moved through corridors like shadows in service of purity, their silence absolute. Their power was not measured by rank or wealth, but by proximity to secrets. They were the keepers of innocence, not in mercy, but in vigilance. Within palace walls, even their footsteps carried authority. Courtiers bowed as they passed, not from respect, but from fear of their reach. They knew every passage, every protocol, every whisper that dared to echo through marble halls. The Sultan's word traveled through them. And through them, the empire's obsession with control found its most faithful voice. Those who entered the palace gates left their past behind. No name. No language. No prayer untouched. They were cleansed, educated, transformed into symbols of the empire's divine order. The process was not violent in appearance, it was ritual, elegant, rehearsed. But in its stillness lay the deepest cruelty, the transformation of people into property under the illusion of privilege. The empire's scribes called it purity. Its philosophers called it destiny. Its rulers called it grace. But the truth had no name, only echo. And that echo still drifts through the empty courtyards of Topkapı, caught between beauty and guilt. Centuries later, historians would argue over numbers, logistics, trade routes, facts that reduce agony into data. Yet behind every statistic lies the same quiet question. How much humanity must be sacrificed to maintain perfection? Because purity, once made into policy, devours everything around it. First the victims, then the witnesses, and finally the conscience of the world that allowed it. History remembers the conquerors. Tale of history remembers the conquered. If that difference does not move you to listen, perhaps silence has already won. Dawn rises over the empire's crown. From the sea, the palace looks like a mirage, domes layered upon domes, each one catching the morning light as if reflecting a paradise that never truly existed. But as the ships approach, beauty turns into intimidation. Topkapı is not built to welcome, it is built to remind. Its towers do not rise toward heaven, they lean over the city like watchful sentinels. And you, standing among the arrivals, feel that strange pull between awe and fear, the sense that you are not entering history, but vanishing into it. The gate of felicity looms ahead. They call it that because irony is the empire's oldest language. The arch is carved with verses in gold leaf, lines from holy texts that promise peace and submission. But as you step closer, you feel those words bending under the weight of something unspoken, the quiet knowledge that peace, here, is another word for control. The air changes first. It smells of polished marble, incense, and the faint trace of the sea that brought you here. Drums beat somewhere within the courtyards, a rhythm so slow and steady it feels less like music and more like a heartbeat made of stone. Beyond the gate, silence stands waiting, tall and patient. It is said that the Sultan's eyes could never see everything, yet everything inside these walls moved as if he could. No one spoke above a whisper. Every step echoed like confession. Even the wind seemed trained, it carried the scent of authority, not freedom. Inside, the procession halts. Scribes in crimson robes record each arrival, not by name, but by mark. Every word written here is an act of erasure. One identity struck out, another assigned. The empire believes that to own a body, one must first unmake its language. So, before you even breathe within the palace walls, you are given a new name. It is short, foreign, and strangely hollow. It does not belong to your mouth, but to their order. The ceremony of cleansing follows. Water poured from bronze ewers flows over hands, faces, and hair. The ritual is presented as purity, as honor, as welcome. But the water feels colder than the sea. It strips more than dust, it strips memory. Each droplet that falls to the marble floor carries away a fragment of the person you were. When the servants dress you in linen, the fabric smells of herbs and soap, but beneath that scent lingers something metallic, like fear polished until it gleams. You are led into the White Hall, a chamber both mythical and real, described in travelers' notes yet never fully mapped. The walls are veined with light, smooth as glass. Here, Voices are absorbed instead of echoed. Everything inside seems to hum with invisible purpose. This is where ceremony becomes ritual, and ritual becomes obedience. Supervisors stand in precise lines, their expressions carved from the same stone as the palace itself. Behind them, the eunuchs watch, silent arbiters of order, the empire's most loyal sentinels, their eyes heavy with what they no longer are. Every newcomer is inspected. Movements measured. Speech corrected. Silence enforced. The empire does not demand perfection, it manufactures it. Then comes the first lesson, posture. Back straight. Eyes lowered. To stand here is to erase all traces of origin. The body must learn stillness before the mind can learn surrender. A mistake is not punished loudly. It is corrected with a look, a pause, a silence sharp enough to pierce the soul. From dawn to dusk, the courtyards hum with choreographed grace. Servants move in patterns so practiced they resemble the gears of a clock. Each step, each bow, each breath fits into the architecture itself, a living mechanism of obedience. Topkapı is not merely a palace. It is an organism, fed by hierarchy, pulsing with ritual, sustained by the belief that beauty can erase cruelty. The gardens outside the inner walls bloom in impossible symmetry. Fountains murmur in perfect rhythm. Birds circle above the gilded domes but never land. Even nature seems aware that within these walls, only what serves the empire is allowed to exist. Inside the dormitories, the new arrivals are taught the language of submission. Not through words, but through rhythm. 1,000 repetitions of a single phrase until the tongue forgets how to speak anything else. Language here is not for expression. It is for obedience. The religious scholars arrive next. Their tone is soft, their verses melodic, their purpose absolute. They do not preach salvation, they preach alignment. Faith becomes architecture, built stone upon stone, rule upon rule, until no gap remains where thought might enter. Each lesson begins with a verse and ends with silence. Between them, a truth takes root, that the divine and the imperial are one, and questioning either is blasphemy. At dusk, candles flicker through the corridors. Their light paints the walls gold, but the faces it touches are pale and still. Dinner is silent. Prayers are whispered. Dreams are forbidden. Only reflection remains, not of the self, but of what the empire wants to see when it looks at you. And yet, beneath that polished surface, something ancient stirs, a quiet ache that refuses to vanish. Perhaps it is memory, or the last echo of a name no one will speak again. It lingers between breaths, in the heartbeat that does not match the palace rhythm, in the faint pulse of individuality the empire tries to bury. Topkapı endures not because of the Sultan's will, but because of its silence. The walls absorb every thought, every sigh, every secret. Centuries later, that silence still vibrates through the marble. Tourists will walk these halls and call it history. But you know better. It is not history. It is captivity polished into myth. History remembers the conquerors. Tale of history remembers the conquered. If that difference does not move you to listen, perhaps silence has already won. The palace does not sleep, it only exhales. Its breath seeps through corridors and gardens, curling around pillars carved with verses of mercy. But mercy here is only marble deep. The true keepers of this world walk without footsteps, their silence sharper than any blade, their eyes trained not to see, but to control. They are the eunuchs, the empire's quiet architects of obedience. Men unmade so that the empire could never fear them. Their loyalty is not born of devotion, but of design. Their pain was turned into purpose, their absence into authority. In the hierarchy of Topkapı, they stand apart, divided not by duty but by color and command. The white eunuchs, pale-faced and precise, serve the outer courts, clerks, scribes, attendants who manage the empire's paperwork of power. But beyond the gate of felicity, deeper in the labyrinth of the harem, rule the black eunuchs. Imported from distant lands, severed from their past, they became the empire's most trusted wardens. Their presence is both warning and promise, a living declaration that loyalty requires the death of the self. Each one bears a story too heavy for words, a past buried in deserts and silence. Taken as boys, altered before manhood, reshaped to serve a system that feared desire more than rebellion. They were remade not only in body, but in spirit, taught that proximity to power was a form of redemption. And through centuries, they learned to wield that proximity like a blade wrapped in silk. At their head stands one figure whose name is written carefully in the archives, always in the margins, never in the center. The Kisler Agassi, the chief black eunuch. To outsiders, he appears as a servant, to insiders, he is the empire's unseen axis. He alone may speak directly to the sultan's mother. He alone controls access to the harem, that gilded world of whispers, rivalries, and invisible politics. Ambassadors feared him, viziers bribed him, and even the sultan's word sometimes bent beneath his silence. He was the gatekeeper of secrets, the hand that turned the locks of destiny. Through him, the empire perfected the art of governance without witness. Every message, every audience, every rumor passed through his discretion. He was neither free nor powerless, existing in the space between the two, a shadow that dictated the rhythm of an empire built on restraint. But the system that created him demanded more than service, it demanded sacrifice. The ritual of castration, carried out far from these marble halls, was the empire's cruel alchemy, transforming boys into instruments. No doctor's record, no priest's prayer could soften what that act stole. Yet it was precisely that loss which the palace transmuted into loyalty. To remove temptation was to create trust. To erase identity was to forge permanence. Obedience, the empire believed, was purer when pain had purified its vessel. Those who survived the transformation were brought to the capital, taught to read, to write, to watch. They learned languages, diplomacy, arithmetic, and the most important skill of all, invisibility. They could move through rooms unseen, hear without being noticed, command without raising a voice. They mastered the empire's greatest lesson, that fear is most effective when it does not announce itself. In the palace's secret order, reward and punishment existed side by side, indistinguishable in form. A glance from a superior could elevate a eunuch's station overnight, or erase him entirely from record. To serve flawlessly was to exist, to falter was to vanish. Archives whisper of those who disappeared. Their quarters emptied, their names crossed out with single strokes of ink. But for every vanishing, another rose higher, their loyalty inscribed in promotion, their silence rewarded with gold or favor. The empire had found its perfect machine. Unlike soldiers, the eunuchs did not tire of war. Unlike viziers, they had no lineage to defend. Unlike concubines, they were untouched by desire. Their only ambition was the empire itself, the one master that could not betray them, because it was made of the same silence they had learned to worship. In the still hours before dawn, you can almost hear them move through the corridors. Keys jingling softly. Doors opening to rooms that history forgot. Their shadows glide across the mosaic floors like ink stains that never dry. Each carries in his gaze the knowledge that he guards both power and its illusion. For what is purity without someone to enforce it? What is obedience without someone to observe it? The empire's architects understood this well. They created a hierarchy built upon the ruins of human wholeness, and in doing so, they discovered the cost of control. Obedience became the empire's heartbeat, measured not in blood but in silence. Every whisper, every bow, every act of submission traced back to those who had given everything to maintain the illusion of divine order. Yet, behind the perfection of that system, a question lingers, one too dangerous for any scribe to write. If loyalty is born from mutilation, what does it make of the master? Perhaps the empire itself was the greatest eunuch of all, majestic, disciplined, stripped of its humanity for the sake of power. Centuries later, the marble corridors of Topkapı still carry that echo. Tourists walk where those shadows once moved, unaware that beneath their feet lies a history of loyalty carved from suffering. They look upon the palace and see grandeur. But if they listened closely, they might hear the faint rhythm of keys turning, the soft breath of guardians who gave everything so that others could command. History remembers rulers by their victories. Tale of history remembers those who kept those victories alive, the silent, the unseen, the obedient. If that does not move you to listen, perhaps the empire's silence has already claimed another voice. Morning in Topkapı begins not with sunlight, but with ritual. The palace breathes in unison, fountains murmur, servants glide through marble corridors, and bells hum from distant courtyards. The air carries the scent of rose oil and ink, the two perfumes of power, beauty and record. Every step, every sound, is measured, as though time itself has been disciplined to serve. In the school of grace, perfection is not a lesson, it is law. The halls are lined with mirrors so polished they seem alive, reflecting hundreds of faces that no longer belong to themselves. This is where transformation completes its work, where innocence is refined into performance, and performance becomes survival. The empire calls it education. But it is correction, an art form that replaces will with poise, memory with elegance. At dawn, they are awakened by the chief tutor's soft clap, followed by silence so deep it feels like reverence. Each girl bows before she rises. Their robes are color-coded by rank, muted ivory for novices, deep crimson for those closer to favor. Rank is not spoken, it is worn, breathed, carried in posture. Even the way a hem brushes the floor can betray ambition. The day unfolds with precision. First comes recitation, verses of poetry, lines of devotion, lessons on eloquence. Language is their first weapon, and they are taught to wield it with deadly grace. They copy love poems they will never speak from their own hearts. They memorize metaphors for emotions they are forbidden to feel. Their ink is made of crushed petals and ash, so that beauty and death share the same color. Then, calligraphy. Each stroke must be exact, unbroken, as steady as the empire's rule. Mistakes are not erased, they are burned. The scent of singed parchment fills the air, a small warning that even imperfection leaves evidence. The tutors say handwriting reveals the soul, so the girls learn to disguise theirs. They learn to write beautifully without leaving a trace of who they are. After noon, they move to the chambers of comportment. Lessons in movement, posture, and the delicate art of gaze. They walk in circles, balancing porcelain dishes on their heads, learning how to glide instead of step, how to bend without appearing to yield. Each gesture must speak of humility while concealing calculation. Every smile must hide its origin, every glance must promise nothing but attention. The body, once free, becomes a vessel of diplomacy. Here, beauty is not a gift, it is a burden carried in silence. For the Sultan's gaze is both crown and curse. It falls rarely, unpredictably, and when it does, it rewrites lives in a single heartbeat. Those chosen ascend to luxury that glitters like divinity, those ignored fade into the corridors like ghosts rehearsing the art of invisibility. No one knows which is worse, to be seen, or to be forgotten. In the evenings, the lessons turn to music and grace. Instruments shimmer under candlelight, their strings plucked by trembling fingers. Each note is a prayer disguised as melody. Every word of a song is vetted, weighed, rehearsed until even grief sounds harmonious. They are taught to laugh softly, to cry without sound, to make sorrow appear like devotion. But beneath this surface of calm ritual, a different world stirs, one of rivalry, suspicion, and quiet war. The harem is not merely a sanctuary, it is a battlefield of silk and whispers. Every smile hides calculation. Every friendship is a risk wrapped in courtesy. A misplaced compliment, a stolen glance, a rumor carried by a servant can redraw the invisible map of power overnight. The walls hear everything. And what the walls hear, the eunuchs repeat. Espionage blooms in secrecy. Notes written on petals, glances exchanged across lessons, gifts sent and withdrawn, every act is both message and trap. The Valide Sultan, unseen but omnipresent, oversees this ecosystem of controlled chaos. Her silence is an empire within an empire, her approval a currency more valuable than gold. A single tilt of her head can elevate a girl from obscurity to the Sultan's chamber, or cast her into oblivion. The older concubines, those who have survived years of the palace's tides, become tutors themselves, ambassadors of caution. They speak in riddles, warning the young that affection here is a form of exposure, that kindness can be mistaken for rebellion. They tell them, the walls love obedient hearts, not honest ones. And so, the young learn faster than they should, adapting smiles to conceal terror, gestures to mask fatigue. By night, when candles are dimmed and the palace finally exhales, the girls lie awake in their narrow beds. Sleep does not come easily. Their minds replay the day's lessons, searching for errors invisible to anyone but themselves. Was the bow too shallow? The word too hesitant? The smile too long? The questions never end, because perfection is a horizon that retreats the closer you walk toward it. Over time, the transformation deepens. They begin to mimic each other, voices merging, movements synchronized, individuality dissolving like sugar in water. The palace does not destroy them, it refines them until there is nothing left to destroy. Their memories blur, their accents fade, their names lose meaning. They become interchangeable reflections of grace, identical in beauty, indistinguishable in sorrow. To survive here is to forget who you were. And so they forget, not all at once, but gradually, like ink fading on old parchment. The mind learns to protect itself by detaching from its own pain. Smiles become muscle memory, laughter becomes armor. Even grief learns discipline. This is how the empire manufactures obedience, through elegance, through repetition, through the slow erosion of the self. Every rule, every ritual, every whispered correction wears down the soul until submission feels like peace. By the time a girl earns the privilege of being noticed, she no longer remembers whether she ever wanted to be. The eunuchs, ever watchful, note their progress in silent ledgers. A name crossed out, another moved higher. The palace runs on these adjustments, its order maintained by 1,000 invisible exchanges of fear and favor. And through it all, the empire stands unshaken, radiant in its illusion of divine harmony. But the harmony is built on fracture. The beauty is painted over absence. The songs that fill these chambers are hymns of amnesia, sung by voices that no longer recall what it means to belong to themselves. Centuries later, visitors will admire the palace's artistry, the mosaics, the fountains, the symmetry. They will marvel at the perfection of it all. They will not realize that perfection was achieved by erasing everything human. They will not hear the echoes of the lessons still trapped within the walls, the rhythmic steps, the whispered verses, the prayers whispered by those who were taught that silence was holiness. Empires endure because they teach people to confuse obedience with grace. And the school of grace, in all its splendor, was the empire's masterpiece. History remembers rulers for the power they commanded. Tale of history remembers those who paid the price of that power with their voices, their names, and their souls. If that does not move you to listen, perhaps history's silence has already claimed your attention. Power in the palace has no scent, no sound, no shadow. It moves like breath, unseen, yet present in every whisper, in every step that dares to echo too loudly against marble floors. Here, behind the gilded latticework of the harem, politics does not shout, it waits. It watches. It smiles. The empire calls this place sacred, a sanctuary guarded by faith and loyalty. But within its silken walls, the most dangerous wars are fought, wars without swords, without banners, without the dignity of truth. Every gaze, every smile, every bow of the head conceals an intention. Here, beauty has become a battlefield, and silence, the deadliest weapon of all. At the heart of this invisible empire sits one woman, the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother. She wears no crown, yet every crown in the empire bends toward her. Her words shape the Sultan's will, her silence can end a life. To the outside world, she is a figure of devotion, a matron of virtue. But within these walls, she is something far greater and far darker, the embodiment of power that no man can openly name. Every morning, before the court begins its rituals, her chambers awaken in shadowed reverence. The air smells of amber and authority. Letters arrive sealed in wax, carried by eunuchs who bow without meeting her eyes. No council convenes without her knowing. No concubine ascends without her consent. No vizier dares speak her name in jest. In the empire's vast machinery, she is the unseen engine, a woman forged by captivity, who learned to command through stillness. Her dominion is not over land or army, but over the Sultan himself. She rules the one who rules the world. But she was not always power. She was once one of the chosen, taken, renamed, redefined, just like the others. She learned obedience not as surrender, but as disguise. Every lesson in grace, every act of silence, every bow was a rehearsal for survival. And when her moment came, when her beauty caught the Sultan's gaze, when her son inherited the throne, the captive became the throne itself. History remembers two of them best. Their stories are not myths, they are warnings carved into time. Hurrem Sultan, once a slave from the plains of Ruthenia, her laughter was said to have disarmed the Sultan himself. She entered the palace nameless, but her wit was sharper than any blade gilded for ceremony. Through patience, intelligence, and ruthlessness, she rose above every rule the empire had written to contain her. She learned that affection was a currency and influence, a language without grammar. When she became valide, her enemies called her witch, seductress, heretic. They were right to fear her. Her pen, her whisper, her smile changed the course of an empire. She redefined what power meant, not by defiance, but by mastering the art of control within captivity. Her triumphs were not victories of love, they were victories of calculation. She transformed her chains into a crown and proved that the empire's greatest weapon was not its armies, but its women. Then came Kozum Sultan, her name spoken in fear even by those who had never seen her face. She rose generations later, a shadow that outlived sultans, viziers, and sons. Her rule spanned decades, her influence reaching from the nursery to the council hall. They say she could read loyalty in a single glance and betrayal in a heartbeat. Where Hurrem conquered with charm, Kozum ruled with caution. Her hands never touched a blade, but her orders sharpened many. She orchestrated marriages, alliances, and executions with the precision of a clockmaker adjusting the hands of destiny. And yet, she too lived beneath a veil of terror, for in the empire of silence, power does not protect, it consumes. In the end, her enemies found her strangled with the same silk cords once used to enforce her rule. A fitting end, the chroniclers wrote, for one who had turned obedience into empire. These women, remembered by historians as anomalies, were not anomalies at all. They were the logical outcome of a system that devoured innocence and turned survival into art. They learned the empire's cruelest secret: when the body is imprisoned, the mind must learn to rule. And rule they did, through persuasion, manipulation, and fear, until the Sultan himself became another captive within his mother's shadow. The palace became a reflection of their will. Walls that once trembled under the Sultan's command now whispered the names of those who served the valide. All correspondence passed through her intermediaries. All decisions bore her unseen seal. When a concubine's laughter grew too loud, she disappeared. When a vizier's ambition outpaced his gratitude, his wine turned bitter by morning. Poison replaced decree. Silence replaced confession. The empire learned to breathe through veils, each one thinner than the last, each one more suffocating. Even the eunuchs, the tireless keepers of order, learned to bow deeper in her presence. For they knew that she, more than any sultan, understood the architecture of obedience. She was not born into power, she was built from it, stone by stone, silence by silence. The harem, once a prison, evolved into a parliament of invisible hands. Its courtyards, once echoing with prayers, now murmured with strategy. Every alliance was temporary, every gesture a performance. A misplaced glance could become a rumor could become a death sentence. Poison became the punctuation of politics, clean, quiet, irrefutable. And yet, beyond all the calculation and cruelty, there lies something more human, the tragedy of women who learn to survive by becoming the very thing that enslaved them. Power, here, is not freedom. It is another form of captivity, adorned with jewels, perfumed with control. The higher they rose, the lonelier the air became. Their smiles grew softer, their hearts quieter, their faith colder. Even victory tasted of loss. Grief was not named, it was buried. And so, disease became another layer of silence. When plague swept through Istanbul, the palace sealed its gates. When fever took a concubine, her body was carried out under moonlight, veiled and wordless. The empire could not risk the rumor of decay. The marble had to gleam. But even marble remembers touch. Even gold corrodes beneath sweat. And the harem, no matter how polished, was a living body, one that aged, ached, and wept. It devoured its own youth to sustain its illusion of eternity. For every heir born, countless lives were spent unseen. For every moment of imperial pride, another body faltered in silence. The empire that claimed to rule the world could not rule the human heart, nor the body that carried it. And so it learned to hide both. The forgotten bodies became part of the architecture, the quiet foundation on which beauty stood. Every courtyard, every bathhouse, every perfumed chamber had known suffering too delicate to record. The walls were not only built with stone, they were held together by the memory of what was endured within them. And somewhere beneath all that silence, an unspoken truth took shape. That the empire which worshipped purity was built on the impurity of its own denial. That the same hand which held the silk cord also held the midwife's towel. That control and care, power and pain, were merely reflections of each other, caught forever in the mirrored halls of Topkapı. Time erases the names but not the weight of their absence. The empire fell, the palace turned to museum, and still, in the soft light of its corridors, the air feels heavy, as if remembering too much. Because no empire dies quietly. It leaves behind its ghosts, not of kings or warriors, but of the bodies that were never meant to be remembered. History remembers empires for the crowns they wore. Tale of history remembers them for the bodies they buried beneath those crowns. If you can listen to all this, to centuries of women who lived, suffered, and vanished without a word, and still scroll away without subscribing. Remember this. The forgotten body is not gone. It waits, quietly, in the places where history refused to look. Power in the Ottoman world was not built by swords alone. It was born in silence, in the fragile rhythm of breath beneath veiled chambers, in the heartbeat of a mother who knew her survival depended on what she carried. Because in this empire of marble and decree, the most dangerous battlefield was not a field at all. It was the womb. Here, womanhood was rewritten as strategy. Pregnancy was not life, it was politics. Every flutter within a concubine's belly could alter the course of dynasties. Every cry of a newborn carried both promise and peril. And every mother learned, quickly, that creation itself was no longer divine, it was bureaucratic. The harem had many chambers, but none more sacred, or more feared, than the birthing rooms. They were places of ritual and restraint, perfumed with herbs meant to calm, watched by eyes trained not to comfort, but to confirm. When a concubine became pregnant, her life changed instantly. Her meals, her sleep, her prayers, her every movement became the property of the empire. She was guarded, not out of love, but out of calculation. Because inside her, within the fragile uncertainty of her body, rested the empire's future, or its undoing. Midwives, eunuchs, and physicians surrounded her constantly. Their duty was not only to protect, but to observe. Every pulse counted, every pain documented. The process was sacred in ceremony, clinical in practice. Even her dreams were monitored, for dreams were thought to reveal the gender of the unborn child. If she dreamt of water, they whispered it would be a boy. If she dreamt of fire, they feared it would be a girl. And in a world where gender determined destiny, such whispers shaped her fate before her child had even drawn breath. When a boy was born, the palace erupted in orchestrated joy. Drums rolled. Prayers thundered through the courtyards. Gold coins were scattered into the Bosphorus as offerings to divine favor. But beneath that celebration, something darker began to form, a hierarchy of bloodlines, each mother now a player in a game that allowed no allies. Because in the empire's logic, only one boy could truly matter, the one who would inherit the throne. The rest were living threats. And so, the rivalries began long before the sons could even speak. Mothers measured each other's glances like daggers. Gifts were given not out of generosity, but as warnings wrapped in silk. Every lullaby hid calculation. Every act of kindness, a test. To raise a son here was to raise a potential corpse or a future ruler. There was no in-between. The palace had rules for everything, for how a child should be swaddled, how a mother should sit, even how joy should be displayed. Too much happiness invited suspicion. Too little suggested deceit. The Valide Sultan, the Sultan's own mother, presided over all, her word law, her gaze cold. She had lived this game once, and she knew, in the politics of the womb, sentiment was suicide. The empire recorded every birth, but never the price of it. Behind the ceremonies lay the unspoken fear, that one life's beginning might demand another's end. Because Ottoman succession did not pass peacefully. It was forged in blood, sanctified by necessity. The chronicles are careful, polite, and vague. They speak of unexpected passings, of divine will, of sorrow following joy. But behind those euphemisms lies a truth whispered for centuries, that the empire, to preserve stability, often murdered its own future. The practice was not called by its name. It was simply understood, when a new sultan ascended, his brothers would not live to challenge him. The palace called it preventing chaos. Historians call it fratricide. But for the women who bore those sons, it was an unending nightmare dressed as tradition. A mother's love, in this system, was a liability. To weep for a doomed son was dangerous. To hope for his survival was foolish. And so, they learned to grieve before the loss arrived, to love silently, without the luxury of illusion. Every smile given to a child was shadowed by the knowledge that his life belonged to the state. Rumors whispered through the harem's corridors, of silken cords carried in the dead of night, of cries muffled beneath the weight of duty. They say the cords were white, pure, untarnished, to keep the blood of princes unshed. Even death here had to look beautiful. And every mother who heard the faint rustle of footsteps outside her chamber knew, mercy in this palace came wrapped in silk. Some mothers broke. Others hardened. A few learned to weaponize grief itself. They played politics not for themselves, but for the hope that their lineage would survive, that their grandson might inherit where their son had fallen. Generations of women became architects of legacy, maneuvering through rituals, poisonings, and whispered bargains, trading affection for power. They stopped being mothers. They became strategists of survival. The womb was no longer a vessel of life, it was the empire's chessboard. And every child, a piece waiting to be sacrificed. Physicians' journals described their duties with mechanical detachment. The infant was examined, declared healthy, sent to the care of the wet nurse. No mention of the mother's face. No record of her silence. Only the data of destiny. Because in a system where fertility was currency, emotion had no market value. And yet, even within this machinery of fear, something human persisted. In secret, mothers left tokens for their children, threads of cloth, small inscriptions, lockets of hair hidden inside the hems of robes. Tiny rebellions against erasure. Proof that before they became symbols of dynasty, they were simply women who loved. Time has not preserved their names, only their echoes. In the archives, you can still find marginal notes, hastily written, and signed, almost erased. The mother refuses food. The mother weeps at night. The mother prays for mercy. And that last one, mercy, appears again and again, as if written by the same trembling hand through the centuries. The politics of the womb turned faith into function, motherhood into maneuver. It took what was sacred and made it administrative. It taught generations of women to measure their worth not in years, but in heirs. And in doing so, it built an empire that could never love what it created, only control it. The marble still gleams, the records still stand, but beneath the history of conquest and glory lies this quieter truth. That the Ottoman throne was not built on gold alone. It was built on the breath of women who were told that creation was duty, that birth was loyalty, that love was treason. They obeyed. They survived. And in their endurance, they left behind the most haunting legacy of all, a silence that remembers. If you can listen to centuries of mothers who birthed empires and buried their children for its sake, and still scroll away without subscribing, remember this. The politics of power began in their bodies, but it ends in our forgetting. Subscribe to Tale of History, because some silences are too heavy to leave unbroken. At dawn, the Bosphorus glows like a blade, splitting night from day. And there, upon its edge, the palace waits, silent, unmoving, eternal. Topkapı. The empire's heart and its tomb. To the traveler, it is beauty. To the historian, it is power. But to those who once lived within its walls, it was something far more terrible, a labyrinth of obedience that learned to whisper after dark. Because long after its masters turned to dust, the palace continued to breathe. Topkapı was never just a building, it was a mind-given marble. Its architecture was deliberate, every wall a boundary, every door a decision, every locked corridor a confession. The outer courts dazzled with ceremony, filled with music, incense, and the theater of empire. But deeper inside, light dimmed and air thickened, until splendor gave way to silence. Here, corridors bent without reason, rooms existed without doors, stairways led nowhere. The empire built its authority not in openness, but in confusion. Even space itself was designed to obey. There were wings that no servant entered, chambers that no record described. The palace had rules, and then it had silences. Areas spoken of only in gestures, in rumors traded between maids and guards during the slow hours before dawn. Rooms sealed not by locks, but by fear. Foreign envoys, the few allowed to step inside, wrote about what they saw, and more hauntingly, about what they were forbidden to see. Ambassador Busbeck, visiting from Vienna, called it a city enclosed within itself, where walls have memories and courtyards breed secrecy. Another envoy wrote that the further one walked inside, the more the air seemed to resist breath, as though history itself refused to be exhaled. They spoke of gardens without paths, fountains that ran for no one, doors that opened into rooms filled with mirrors instead of windows. Every reflection reminded them, beauty here was surveillance. Among the palace's servants, a different archive endured, the oral one. They whispered of the East Wing, sealed by imperial decree after a night no one dared record. Of a courtyard where footsteps echoed long after the last attendant had died. Of a corridor that always smelled faintly of rose water, no matter how many centuries passed. The older eunuchs swore that at certain hours, you could hear a soft knocking from behind the plaster walls, the rhythm of nails, not ghosts. The younger ones laughed, until they heard it too. No one admitted to believing in hauntings. But everyone knew not to linger after dusk. The marble grew colder then. The torches flickered even without wind. And from the farthest halls, the ones that led nowhere, came the faint sound of water dripping, like time itself still counting the condemned. They say the palace was haunted by the dead. But perhaps it was haunted by memory, by the weight of all it had witnessed and refused to confess. Every secret execution, every silenced scream, every unrecorded grief sank into the walls like moisture, absorbed but never erased. What the empire hid, the palace kept. The corridor of felicity, once the path to the Sultan's inner chambers, became the center of these legends. Servants called it the Hall of Breath. Because those who entered often came out different, quieter, paler, older by years that no calendar measured. Some said that at night, the sound of silk could still be heard brushing along its walls, not cloth, but memory moving through stone. Over time, the stories changed. The ghosts became metaphors. And the metaphors, truths. The palace was no longer just haunted by those who died, it was haunted by the system that refused to die. Each echo, each whisper, each unseen presence was not a specter of the supernatural, but of consequence. Because when cruelty becomes ritual, and obedience becomes architecture, even buildings learn to remember. In that sense, Topkapı never fell. It remains alive, pulsing beneath the city that surrounds it. Visitors wander through its galleries now, cameras flashing, guides reciting the sanitized version of its history, the golden age, the splendor, the civilization. But the stones beneath their feet hum differently. They hum with the residue of something older, the echo of footsteps that never found freedom, the scent of rose water that tried to mask fear. You can still stand in those empty rooms today, where the air feels heavier than it should. You can touch the cold marble railings that once marked the boundary between privilege and punishment. And if you listen carefully, if you truly listen, you might hear it. Not words, but presence. A lingering vibration in the silence, as if the palace itself is trying to finish a sentence cut short 500 years ago. Historians call it myth. But myths are only history that refuse to die properly. The empire built Topkapı to be immortal. It succeeded, just not in the way it intended. The empire is gone. The marble remains. And within that marble, the whispers never stopped. Because architecture, like memory, does not forget who it served. The Palace of Ghosts is not a place on a map, it is a metaphor carved into eternity. It stands for every empire that confused power with permanence, every dynasty that believed silence could outlive guilt. Topkapı, in the end, is not haunted by spirits. It is haunted by its own reflection, the perfect symmetry of cruelty disguised as beauty. And perhaps that is why you can still feel it. The faint unease beneath your admiration. The invisible weight pressing on your breath as you look at the photographs, the carvings, the domes. Because deep down, you understand, the ghosts are not gone. They are simply waiting to be remembered. You're still watching because you feel the weight of these ghosts. Don't just feel it, carry it. Subscribe to Tale of History so the dead are not erased twice. Empires never die when their walls fall, they live on in the mirrors of those who watch them. When the Ottoman Empire began to fade, the world that once feared it began to fantasize about it. And in that fantasy, something darker happened. The suffering that once hid behind lattice and veil was reborn as art, beautiful, exotic, and false. Europe, unable to forget the empire's power, chose instead to romanticize its prisons. Pain became spectacle. Captivity became desire. And the women who had once lived, wept, and vanished within Topkapı's chambers were reborn, not as humans, but as decoration. They called it Orientalism. Painters and poets from Paris to London began to fill their canvases with visions of a world they never saw. Their harems were palaces of pleasure, filled with reclining women bathed in light that never existed. Every brushstroke turned trauma into dream. Every poem blurred domination into devotion. The empire that had once built walls of silence now had its silence rewritten, into eroticism. Jean-Léon Gérôme painted it best, or perhaps worst. His women do not breathe, they pose. They exist for the viewer, not for themselves. Their eyes are open, yet lifeless, their bodies arranged with impossible stillness. Behind them, fountains trickle, incense rises, and the illusion is complete. The harem as paradise, the captive as muse. No marble cracks. No whispers echo. No chords tighten. Pain has been erased so thoroughly it glows. In Angra, Lubane Turk, dozens of women float in circular perfection, their skin luminous, untouched by history. The painter never saw a real harem. He didn't need to. He saw what Europe wanted to believe, that power elsewhere was sensual, not systemic, that domination was delicate, not deliberate. The West could not bear to see its own reflection in the empire's cruelty, so it painted over it. Art became a mirror that lied beautifully. And through that mirror, Europe absolved itself. By turning Ottoman captivity into a spectacle of beauty, it disguised its own, the slave ships, the colonial harems, the plantations where women's bodies were catalogued by race and price. Every fantasy about the Eastern concubine was a projection of Western guilt, a way to eroticize another's oppression and call it admiration. The poets joined the painters. Lord Byron, Gustave Flaubert, Pierre Lodi, they wrote as if they had seen paradise itself. But what they saw were reflections, fantasies dressed in silk, stories born not from empathy but ownership. Their women never spoke, never aged, never resisted. They existed only to confirm what the West wanted to feel, powerful, civilized, and innocent. The irony is cruel. While Europe painted the Ottoman woman as the emblem of sensual captivity, it built its own harems in secret, in colonial courts, in plantation houses, in drawing rooms behind curtains of etiquette. The difference was only in the framing. The Ottoman veil concealed, while the European brush revealed, both to control. When art lies, it becomes a second captivity. The first imprisoned the body, the second imprisons memory. And so, history was rewritten not by rulers, but by artists. The real women, the concubines, the mothers, the forgotten, vanished again, replaced by their fantasies. The harem was no longer a site of politics and fear, it became a stage for pleasure and spectacle. The empire's silence had been exported, gilded, and sold to the world as beauty. Even museums today still hang these paintings in soft light, their plaques describing Orientalist masterpieces. But no label tells you what they hide, the centuries of distortion that turned pain into ornament. Every reclining figure, every gaze of longing, every perfect line of flesh is another name erased, another truth edited out. The most chilling thing about those paintings is not what they show, but what they refuse to show. No bruises. No hierarchy. No fear. Just peace, stillness, and surrender. The viewer is invited not to question, but to consume. And that is how history loses its voice, not through burning, but through beautifying. Empires collapse, but their myths survive in oil and canvas. They hang in galleries like ghosts of indulgence, alluring, dangerous, incomplete. They tell the story of how humanity learns to forgive its own cruelty by making it look divine. If the palace of the Ottomans was a prison built from power, then the art of Europe was a mirror built from denial. One held women captive with chains, the other with fantasy. Both succeeded in silence. The myth of sensual paradise still lives, in film, in literature, in language itself. Exotic, forbidden, temptation, words that sound harmless, but each one carrying centuries of distortion. They are the echoes of that same lie, that beauty erases suffering, that if something looks divine, it cannot have been cruel. But the ghosts inside Topkapı whisper differently. They do not recline. They do not smile. They do not pose for portraits. They remember. They remember how art rewrote their captivity into myth and called it fascination. And when you stand before those paintings today, when you scroll past them online, when you see the word harem turned into metaphor for luxury, you are looking not at history, but at its distortion. The empire's walls may have fallen, but its mirrors still hang. You're still watching because you feel that quiet discomfort, that realization that beauty can be complicit. Don't just admire the reflection. See through it. Because when art lies, it becomes a second captivity. And silence, once again, becomes its frame. Empires do not collapse in a single night. They unravel, thread by thread, truth by truth, until the mask that once looked divine begins to reveal the trembling face beneath it. For centuries, the Ottoman world had survived by controlling the narrative, by scripting its own myths, by polishing its cruelties into virtues, by making silence look sacred. But silence, like marble, eventually cracks. And when it did, what spilled out was not glory, but exhaustion. The 19th century arrived like a mirror held too close to the empire's face. Steamships began to fill the Bosphorus. Newspapers from Europe arrived faster than decrees from the palace. And the whispers of progress began to echo even through the gilded corridors of Topkapı. The empire that once ruled continents now found itself cornered by ideas, liberty, equality, reason. Concepts that could not be silenced by decree or buried under ceremony. The Tanzimat reforms came first, promises of modernization, of law and order remade in the European image. But beneath the official language of progress lay panic. Every reform was an admission, the old gods of obedience were dying. The empire could no longer survive on devotion alone. It needed to convince the world, and itself, that it could change. Topkapı began to fade. Its corridors, once heavy with intrigue, grew quiet. Its gates opened to modernization, and the harem, the heart of its hidden machinery, began to dissolve like a mirage at sunrise. No decree ended it. It simply outlived its purpose. The Sultan moved to Dolmabahce Palace, a marvel of glass and chandelier, designed in imitation of Europe's own monarchies. Gone were the shadowed halls and secret courtyards, now light filled everything, as though the empire wanted to prove it had nothing left to hide. But light can be cruel. It shows what darkness used to protect. The women of the former harem watched this transformation from behind the same veils that once defined them. They were no longer political instruments, yet they were not free. They existed in a twilight. Between tradition and modernity, between reverence and irrelevance. Many were moved into quiet estates, their names forgotten, their histories sealed in archives that would soon disappear. But not all stayed silent. Some learned to write. And through ink, they reclaimed what the empire had stolen, their voices. They were the early Ottoman feminists, women like Fatma Ali, Halide Edip, Nezihe Muhyiddin, names once whispered, now reclaimed. They began to write about the harem not as paradise or prison, but as experience. Their pens became instruments of resurrection, cutting through centuries of censorship. They wrote essays, novels, and manifestos questioning not only empire, but faith, patriarchy, and the myth of feminine submission. Their courage was revolutionary. They were not fighting an emperor, they were fighting the memory of obedience that lived inside their culture's veins. They spoke of education, equality, and rights, words that sounded foreign in a language still haunted by hierarchy. Their critics called them westernized. But in truth, they were not imitating Europe. They were reclaiming what had always been theirs, autonomy. The printing press became their ally. Ink replaced rumor, pages replaced courtyards. For the first time in Ottoman history, women's words traveled farther than the Sultan's decree. And that terrified the old order. But as these new voices rose, the empire itself was collapsing under the weight of modernity. Wars, debt, foreign intervention, all eating away at the myth of divine sovereignty. And like all systems built on control, when power began to die, it tried to rewrite its death. The final chapters of the empire were written not in triumph, but in denial. As the republic rose from its ashes, the old archives were sealed. Some burned quietly. Some were edited. Some simply vanished. Official historians called it reorganization. But it was something darker, erasure dressed as progress. The harem, once the empire's most powerful secret, was transformed into something decorative, something harmless. Guidebooks described it as an exotic custom, a symbol of refinement. Its history was sterilized, rewritten for tourists who preferred beauty over truth. The trauma became architecture, and the empire's silence, now centuries old, was repackaged as heritage. Topkapı turned into a museum. The corridors that once swallowed screams now host laughter and camera flashes. Visitors marvel at the tiles, the jewels, the symmetry, but not the suffering that built them. Plaques describe the harem as a place of feminine grace, an educational space for women. No mention of the silk cords. No mention of the politics of the womb. No mention of the forgotten bodies buried in unmarked graves along the palace walls. History, once again, performed its favorite ritual, forgetting. Because it is easier to remember the beauty than to confront the cruelty that created it. It is easier to preserve the marble than to speak of the blood that stained it. And so the empire's crimes did not vanish, they fossilized. Their ghosts were not exorcised, they were framed behind glass. Modern Turkey looked westward, embracing a new identity, secular, enlightened, forward. But as it built schools, factories, and parliaments, it inherited the one tradition the empire had perfected, silence. The stories of the women, the servants, the eunuchs, the forgotten, all were dismissed as relics of a barbaric age best left unspoken. Trauma became taboo. And taboo, when left untouched, becomes amnesia. The empire had taught its people well, that forgetting is the cleanest form of obedience. So the women who had once written, fought, remembered, they too were edited out of the grand narrative. Their books went out of print. Their names disappeared from curricula. The language of their resistance turned into a dialect only historians could decipher. The survivors of the harem era, those who lived long enough to see modernity, died in quiet corners, their memories dismissed as superstition. And thus, the empire won again, not through domination, but through disappearance. But no silence lasts forever. Every monument is a mask, and masks crumble. The cracks are already visible, in letters rediscovered, in songs remembered, in stories once forbidden now retold. Each recovered name is a small act of defiance against centuries of erasure. Each restored truth is a hand reaching through time, demanding to be heard. The empire may have mastered control, but it could never control what it feared most, memory. Because memory, once awakened, does not kneel. It returns like tide, slow but unstoppable, washing over the ruins of denial. And when it does, history begins to breathe again, not as glory, but as warning. The harem's silence was never just Ottoman. It was universal, repeated in every system that traded humanity for hierarchy, every culture that buried its pain under progress. And that silence still echoes, dressed now in new words, new nations, new myths. The mask has begun to crumble. What remains is not shame, but truth. And truth, once spoken, cannot be resealed in archives. If you can still hear these ghosts, if their stories have followed you through centuries of silence and denial, don't let them vanish again. You're still watching because some part of you knows that history deserves witnesses, not spectators. So don't turn away. Don't let the mask rebuild itself. Subscribe to Tale of History. Because forgetting is how empires survive. But remembering is how humanity heals.